Early morning, AD 1215. From the battlements of a besieged castle, weary defenders catch sight of their worst fear taking shape below. In the grey dawn light, a timber roof on wheels is rolling slowly towards the fortress gate. Beneath its sloping cover hangs a huge oak log, and dozens of enemy soldiers are straining to push the structure forward. Suddenly, boom! A deep crash reverberates through the stone walls. The massive log has slammed into the castle's wooden gate. Splinters fly on the first hit. A moment later, boom! It strikes again, the gate shuddering and cracking under the impact. The besiegers have brought up a battering ram, and the final act of the siege has begun. For over 2,000 years, one siege weapon struck fear into the hearts of defenders like no other: the battering ram. This massive, blunt instrument, often nothing more than a great wooden beam wielded by dozens of soldiers, could splinter gates and shatter walls that had stood for generations. In this immersive journey, we will explore the battering ram's story from its earliest origins in the ancient world to its dominance in medieval warfare. We will witness how it was built, transported, and deployed on the battlefield, how attackers used it to crack fortresses wide open, and how defenders devised ingenious ways to resist its onslaught. Along the way, we will meet the engineers, carpenters, and laborers whose skills made these siege engines possible. By the end, we'll understand the battering ram's legacy, how this simple yet formidable weapon shaped the design of castles and the very nature of siege warfare until the age of gunpowder brought its reign to an end. Origins in the ancient world. Our journey begins in the ancient world, where the battering ram first emerged as a solution to the problem of breaching fortified walls. One early hint comes from ancient Egypt. A tomb painting from around 2000 BC shows soldiers attacking a fortress under cover of a mobile wooden shelter, using a long pole that looks strikingly like a primitive battering ram. But it was in Mesopotamia and the Near East that this weapon truly came into its own. By the 9th century BC, the Assyrian Empire was pioneering siege warfare on an unprecedented scale. Picture an Assyrian siege. Under a blistering sun, ranks of Assyrian soldiers roll a massive wooden siege engine toward the city gates. The contraption is essentially a giant wheeled shed with a heavy log suspended inside it. The log's head is capped in iron, and the whole structure is draped in wet animal hides to protect it from fire. As it lumbers forward, teams of warriors inside swing the great timber back and forth on its chains. With each forward swing, the iron-tipped log crashes into the enemy's wall with a thunderous boom, shaking stones loose and striking fear into those huddled on the ramparts above. Assyrian relief carvings give us a vivid glimpse of these early battering rams in action. In one such carving from the 800s BC, an Assyrian ram on wheels is shown attacking a town wall. The defenders desperately try everything to stop it. They lean over the parapets with flaming torches, trying to set the wooden ram aflame, and even lower a heavy chain in front of it to entangle or immobilize the beam. Meanwhile, the Assyrian attackers respond in kind. Some soldiers strain to pull the obstructing chain away, while others keep the ram's roof wet so that the flames sputter out on the soaked hides. These images reveal a contest of innovations, a powerful offensive weapon met by equally inventive defensive tactics. The basic principle of the battering ram spread across the ancient world. During the Iron Age, roughly the first millennium BC, sieges from the Middle East to the Mediterranean increasingly featured large beams used as wall breakers. Siege engineers learned to suspend the heaviest logs from ropes or chains within wooden frames, allowing the ram to swing like a pendulum and hit with far greater force than a handheld log. They reinforced the beams with metal bands to prevent them from splitting, and often fitted a cast metal tip, sometimes shaped like a ram's horned head, onto the end to focus the impact. This practice gave the battering ram its very name, not just for the act of ramming, but from those iron caps shaped like the head of a charging ram. Such improvements meant that a well-built ram could punch through even masonry walls, given enough time. Stone and mud brick fortifications that had stood for ages were suddenly vulnerable to this relentless pounding, and generals took note. One of the earliest recorded uses of a battering ram in the West comes from ancient Rome's early wars. In 503 BC, Roman forces besieging a Latin town reportedly raised battering rams and other works against the walls. The first hint of Roman adoption of this new siege engine. A generation later in Greece, during the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans built a battering ram to assault the city of Plataea in 427 BC. This appears to be the debut of the battering ram in Greek warfare. Greek historians describe how the Spartans constructed a large wooden ram and brought it up to batter Plataea's walls. The defenders of Plataea, however, were ready. They flung down ropes with hooks to latch onto the ram, and even dropped a huge beam from the ramparts, smashing the Spartan ram before it could breach the wall. Already, the pattern was clear. No sooner was the battering ram deployed than defenders began devising clever countermeasures to defeat it. Over the next centuries, siege warfare became increasingly sophisticated. The successors of Alexander the Great in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC created enormous siege engines, and the humble battering ram was scaled up to terrifying proportions. Alexander himself used rams during his campaigns, for example, at the Siege of Tyre in 332 BC. His engineers built giant wheeled towers with battering rams to pound the city's walls once a causeway had been constructed to reach the island. Perhaps even more impressively, Demetrius Poliorcetes, meaning the besieger, a Macedonian king of the Hellenistic period, constructed one of the largest battering rams ever recorded. During his epic siege of Rhodes in 305 BC, Demetrius built a battering ram said to be 55 meters, 180 feet, long, requiring thousands of men to operate. This monstrous device was mounted in a mobile siege tower called Helepolis, taker of cities, and could deliver crushing blows, though in the end, the Rhodian defenders managed to outlast Demetrius's siege. The rising power of Rome eagerly embraced siegecraft as well. Roman legions became masters of building and using battering rams when storming enemy cities. Time and again throughout the Republic and Empire, the thud of Roman rams echoed against rebel fortresses and city gates. The Romans typically assembled their battering rams on site from locally felled trees and ironwork prepared by their engineers. They often built protective sheds or moved up siege towers to cover the ram's approach. At the Siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Roman army employed a particularly famous battering ram. It was so large and effective that the defenders gave it a nickname, Nico, meaning conqueror. Ancient historian Flavius Josephus recounts how this mighty Roman ram relentlessly battered the walls of Jerusalem day and night. The Jewish defenders tried everything to defeat Nico's blows. They hung up sacks stuffed with chaff to act as cushions and absorb the impact of the ram's head. For a short time, these hanging bags softened the strikes, but the Romans responded by using long poles with hooks to snag the sacks and pull them down. With nothing left to impede it, the massive ram pounded away until it cracked the stones and breached the wall. Shortly thereafter, the Roman legions poured through the gap. Battering rams had proven their worth in antiquity, but they also spurred changes in defensive architecture. Cities began strengthening their gates with iron bands and building walls ever thicker to resist the ram's impact. Some fortifications were designed with low outer walls or moats to keep siege engines at a distance. Defenders, too, learned to be inventive under siege, whether by burning rams, blunting them with barriers, or sallying out in sudden raids to destroy them. This technological tug-of-war continued through the ancient era. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century AD, the battering ram was a well-established, if not routine, part of siege warfare across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. After the fall of Rome, however, the grand tradition of siege engineering waned in Western Europe for a time. In the early Middle Ages, the centuries after 500 AD, warfare was often more decentralized, and many armies lacked the resources or expertise to build elaborate siege machines. Many sieges were settled by blockade, starvation, or trickery, rather than by storming with rams and towers. Still, the knowledge of the battering ram never disappeared. The Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire continued to use sophisticated siege engines, and in the Islamic world and Asia, sieges with rams and other devices remained part of warfare. By the High Middle Ages in Europe, around the 11th and 12th centuries, The battering ram was poised to return in full force as new castles and fortified cities rose across the landscape. The battering ram in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, the battering ram re-emerged with a vengeance as soon as fortified castles and city walls became the dominant military architecture. By the 11th and 12th centuries, as stone castles sprang up across the continent, armies once again needed heavy siege tools to crack these defenses. Early medieval warfare had sometimes relied on simpler tactics or siege starvation, but now the stage was set for a revival of siege engineering know-how. During the Crusades, late 11th to 13th centuries, European armies relearned the value of battering rams. Chronicles from the Crusades describe how knights and engineers built rams to assault the gates of well-defended cities. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, for instance, the Crusaders brought forth large battering rams to smash at the city's formidable walls and gates, significantly aiding in the city's capture after a long and bloody siege. The design of medieval battering rams often followed the same fundamental principles as their ancient predecessors, but with refinements suited to the era. A typical medieval ram consisted of a massive tree trunk, sometimes sharpened or capped with an iron head, suspended by chains or ropes from the roof of a mobile shed-like structure. This protective housing was known as a penthouse or pentite, and it shielded the attackers operating the ram. The penthouse had a sturdy timber frame and a steeply angled roof, resembling a small hut on wheels. Its roof and sides were usually covered in fresh, wet animal hides or soaked wool blankets. This coating kept the structure from catching fire when defenders shot flaming arrows or poured down incendiaries. The hide-covered shelter was also nicknamed the cat by some medieval soldiers, perhaps because it crept up to the walls and clawed at them, much like a cat going after its prey. Moving and positioning a battering ram under fire was a perilous task. First, the attackers had to reach the walls. If a castle was protected by a moat or ditch, the besiegers would labor to fill it with earth, timber, or rubble to create a path for the ram. Once clear ground to the wall or gate was achieved, teams of men pushed the wheeled ram structure forward. They used ropes, rollers, and levers to maneuver it across rough ground. As the ram approached the target, every man inside knew he was within range of the defender's arrows, crossbow bolts, and anything else hurled down from above. The penthouse's wooden roof and sides, reinforced with iron plates or thick planks, provided some cover. Often the men had to crouch inside as missiles thudded against the roof. At the final stage, the crews sometimes removed the wheels from their penthouse, letting it settle firmly onto the ground. This prevented the structure from rolling or recoiling with each strike of the ram. With the ram now in place, the real work began. Inside the cramped shelter, dozens of strong soldiers heaved at the suspended log. Working in unison, they pulled the beam back, then drove it forward against the wall or gate in a steady, rhythmic motion. The chain suspension allowed the log to swing freely, amplifying its impact. With each mighty crash, the battering ram's iron-capped head slammed into the enemy fortification. The boom of each impact echoed like thunder, a deep, shuddering sound that rattled stone and bone alike. If it was a wooden gate, the blows would splinter boards, shatter beams, and weaken barlocks. If it was a stone wall, the blows might knock out chips of mortar and stone, eventually cracking the masonry if concentrated on one spot. Rams were most effective against timber defenses, particularly the heavy oak doors barricading most main gates. Against solid stone fortifications, a battering ram worked more slowly, and attackers often aimed for a wall's corner or base, where the structure was slightly less robust. The men operating the ram had to maintain a relentless pace, hammering the same point repeatedly. They often coordinated their swings to a shouted chant or drumbeat, ensuring that everyone shoved together for maximum force. In some accounts, scores of men, meaning dozens, were packed into a large ram's housing, heaving in concert until their target began to buckle. While the ram pounded away, the battle raged all around it. The attackers did not rely on the ram alone to win the siege. They combined it with other tactics. Archers and crossbowmen positioned nearby laid down covering fire at the castle ramparts, trying to pin down any defender who might poke out to target the ram crew. The ram's shelter itself took a beating from above. Defenders might drop heavy stones, aiming to smash the roof, or pour boiling water, hot sand, or flaming tar in hopes of setting the ram alight or scalding the men beneath. To counter this, some penthouse roofs were layered with dirt or metal sheets in addition to wet hides. Meanwhile, behind the ram, more of the besieging army stood ready. If the ram succeeded in breaching a gate, those troops would rush forward through the splintered opening to storm the fortress. Using a battering ram demanded not only courage from the soldiers at the forefront, but careful coordination by the commanders. It was common to use feints and multiple simultaneous attacks to overwhelm the defense. For example, while one team worked the ram at the main gate, elsewhere other soldiers might be raising ladders against the walls or tunneling underneath the fortifications. Siege towers could be rolled up to provide elevated firing platforms, and catapults or trebuchets would launch stones to shake the walls and distract the defenders. Under the din of these overlapping assaults, the battering ram crews methodically continued their deadly pendulum swings against the chosen weak point. Medieval chroniclers recount numerous sieges where battering rams played a decisive role. During the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century, Simon de Montfort's forces besieging towns in southern France often constructed cats, covered rams, to break through gates after days of bombardment. In England's civil wars of the 12th century, rival barons dragged battering rams to their sieges of each other's stone keeps. In Eastern Europe, the Mongol armies of the 13th century applied sophisticated siege techniques learned from Chinese and Persian engineers. At the great city of Kiev in 1240, for example, the Mongols methodically battered down the fortified gates with rams after days of bombardment, opening a breach that allowed them to pour into the city. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, however, the battering ram's preeminence as a siege weapon was beginning to wane. New technology and tactics were shifting the balance. The invention of the counterweight trebuchet, a powerful catapult capable of hurling huge stones, allowed attackers to break walls from a distance, reducing the need to physically roll a ram up to the fortification. Wealthy kings and commanders came to favour these long-range siege engines. For instance, King Edward I of England, during his 1304 siege of Stirling Castle, brought along an array of fearsome machines. Foremost was Warwolf, the largest trebuchet of its time, which could smash masonry with ease. A battering ram was present at Stirling too, used to batter at the gates, but it was the trebuchet that ultimately compelled the castle to surrender. Likewise, in the closing decades of the medieval period, early gunpowder artillery, crude cannons, began to appear on European battlefields. A single cannon shot could, in seconds, do the damage a battering ram took hours to inflict. Thus, as the 1300s wore on, battering rams were increasingly relegated to a supporting role or brought out only when other methods failed. The age of the great swinging ram was drawing to a close, soon to be ended outright by the boom of cannon fire. Yet in the high medieval era, before gunpowder took over, the battering ram had few equals in the bloody business of storming a fortified wall, defending against the ram. Inside a besieged castle, the moment a battering ram's blunt nose slammed into the main gate was one of chilling realization for the defenders. A deep thud reverberated through the walls. Dust shook from ceiling timbers with each impact. The castle's garrison knew at once that the attackers had brought up a ram, and that the clock was now ticking to stop it. They had to act fast, using every trick in their arsenal. Castle builders and defenders developed many strategies to blunt the effectiveness of a battering ram. The first line of defense was often architecture itself. Fortifications were designed to make it as difficult as possible for a ram to even reach the walls. Deep moats, steep earth embankments, and sheer stone curtain walls all served to keep siege engines at bay. A moat or ditch could stop a wheeled ram unless the attacker took the time to fill it in. Many castles featured multiple rings of walls or outworks. An outer barbican or trench might force the enemy to approach under fire long before they reached the main gate. Castles also strengthened their gateways to withstand ramming. Heavy oak doors were reinforced with iron bands and studs, and often a second or third door lay behind the first, creating multiple barriers. Defenders might also brace a gate from inside by wedging thick beams or piling up rubble and earth behind it to absorb the ram's blows. Vertical sliding barriers called portcullises, made of iron or thick wood, could be dropped down to block a passage if the outer gate was breached. The areas directly in front of and behind gates were killing zones, overlooked by machicolations, stone projections with holes, or wooden hoardings above, through which defenders could rain down missiles and liquids on anyone trying to batter down the doors. When a battering ram did manage to reach the wall or gate, the defenders still had an arsenal of countermeasures at their disposal. From the battlements, they would drop anything heavy they could muster, large rocks, sharpened logs, or even pieces of furniture, aiming to crush the ram's roof or the soldiers beneath. Cauldrons of scalding water or boiling oil, when oil could be spared, might be overturned onto the attackers. Sometimes, defenders used less expensive but equally cruel substances. Hot sand or quicklime, a caustic powder, could be poured or thrown down. Hot sand would slip through armor and cause terrible burns, while quicklime, when it hit the moist eyes and skin of the enemy, would blind and blister them. Defenders also fired flaming arrows or hurled burning pitch in an attempt to set the battering ram's wooden frame on fire. Many a siege account describes the ram's protective hides steaming and sizzling as flames licked up, while crews frantically doused their shelter with water to keep it from igniting. Some defensive tactics were aimed directly at disabling the ram itself. One clever method was to use grappling hooks or chains. Defenders on the wall would swing down heavy hooks tied to ropes, trying to catch the head or body of the battering ram. If they snagged it, dozens of men on the ramparts would then haul up on the ropes, attempting to lift the ram or tilt it upward. Even if they couldn't hoist the entire ram, they might wrench the beam off target or stall its momentum. In some recorded instances, defenders managed to pull a battering ram's head so that it stuck pointing upward, rendering it useless until the attackers freed it. Occasionally, a castle's garrison even rigged a heavy timber as a pendulum inside their gatehouse, then released it at the right moment to slam into the ram below, a crude but potentially effective countermove. Another ploy was to drop a weighted obstacle right in front of the ram at the moment of impact. A well-timed sack of sand or bundle of straw dropped between the ram and the wall could absorb the blow, sparing the wall from damage. This trick, however, required split-second timing and nerves of steel from the defenders leaning over the crenellations. If the situation grew desperate, the garrison might resort to an all-or-nothing sally, a sudden sortie out of a side gate or postern door. Under cover of darkness or at a vulnerable moment, a team of brave volunteers would rush out to attack the battering ram directly. Their goal could be to kill or scatter the ram's crew, to chop up and disable the mechanism, or to set the ram on fire from up close. Such sallies were risky, often resulting in high casualties, but they sometimes succeeded in buying the defenders time by destroying the besiegers' prized engine. Throughout history, the duel between battering ram and fortification was a constant cat-and-mouse game. Every time attackers improved their rams or tactics, defenders answered with new tricks. This arms race led to increasingly resilient castles, as well as increasingly elaborate siege techniques. By the late Middle Ages, many castles had round or angled gate towers that could better deflect blows, and gatehouses were built with murder holes in the ceiling, specifically to target ram crews below. In turn, attackers learned to coordinate assaults, protecting their ram until the last moment. The contest between battering ram and defender was a dramatic showcase of human ingenuity on both sides, with survival hanging in the balance. The engineers and siege crews behind every great battering ram was a team of dedicated engineers, artisans, and labourers who turned ideas into reality. Building and deploying a ram was as much an engineering project as it was an act of brute force. Before a siege even began, medieval commanders had to plan for the construction of siege engines and gather the necessary manpower and materials. Kings would summon skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, and engineers, often called ingeniators, from their domains. These specialists were tasked with designing the siege machines and overseeing their construction. They needed timber, enormous straight tree trunks for the ram itself, and plenty of wood for the supporting frame and roof. They needed iron and steel for tools and for the ram's head and fittings. They needed ropes, chains, nails, and oxhide leather in abundance. All of these had to be procured and transported to the siege site, sometimes over long distances. Logistics played a huge role in siege warfare. Contemporary records from the 13th century illustrate the scale of preparation required. For example, During the 1224 siege of Bedford Castle in England, King Henry III's officials gathered thousands of nails, dozens of thick hides, coils of rope, and large quantities of iron fittings in advance. Carpenters built wooden barricades and penthouses on the spot, while blacksmiths forged the iron caps and bands to reinforce the ram. Large wagons or ox carts were used to haul timbers and prefabricated components of siege structures. In some cases, armies even brought disassembled siege equipment with them: poles, beams, and iron pieces that could be quickly put together at the battlefield. Once the siege began, the engineers directed the construction of the battering ram within the safety of the besiegers' camp. They might build it behind earthen entrenchments or a protective screen, out of range of enemy archers. Day and night, laborers toiled with saws and hammers, assembling the wooden frame, cutting the ram to size, and hanging it in place. Leather workers soaked animal hides in water and draped them over the finished ram shed. Supervising all this were the master engineers, who had to solve practical problems under pressure. Ensuring the wheels could bear the weight, adjusting the length of the chains so the ram swung correctly, and reinforcing any weak points that might break under the strain of repeated blows. When it came time to move the ram and commence the assault, coordination was vital. The crew of the battering ram did not operate in isolation. Supporting soldiers were assigned to push the structure, to carry extra water for dousing fires, and to replace casualties if men were injured by enemy fire. A drum or trumpet signal might mark the moment to surge forward with the ram. The engineers and commanders communicated with flags or shouts to synchronize the ram's advance with other actions, such as covering fire from archers or a simultaneous attack on another section of wall. Operating the ram itself was exhausting, dangerous work. The men inside were often volunteers or specifically selected strong soldiers who understood the risks. They wore whatever armor they could, sometimes padded with extra cloth to cushion against shock, and they tied rags around their ears to muffle the deafening sound of each impact. The engineers might assign a ram captain, a seasoned soldier or junior officer, to lead the crew inside the penthouse, keeping the men in formation and urging them on when fatigue set in. If part of the ram's structure was damaged, for instance, if a section of the roof was crushed by a defender's boulder or set ablaze, carpenters on standby would rush to patch it up even under fire. Every person, from the master engineer to the lowliest woodcutter, had a role to play in this grim enterprise. Siege warfare was sometimes called mechanical warfare, and with good reason. The success of a battering ram assault depended not just on the courage of the troops, but on meticulous preparation by those behind the lines. It required the marshalling of vast resources. Tall trees had to be felled and shaped, metal had to be smelted and cast, and hundreds of hands had to labor in unison. A single ram, if well built and well protected, could bring down a gate that might otherwise hold out for months. That result was only possible thanks to the unsung work of the engineers and logistics crews. Their ingenuity and sweat laid the groundwork for the frontline fighters to push that ram home and finally splinter the defenses of a stubborn fortress. Legacy of the battering ram. For centuries, the battering ram was at the forefront of siege warfare, and its influence can still be felt in the remnants of medieval castles and in military thinking. The threat of battering rams forced defenders to rethink how they built fortifications. Medieval architects reinforced gateways with multiple layers of defense specifically to withstand ramming. Many castles added outer barbicans, drawbridges, and angled bastions, so that an approaching ram could be delayed or channeled into a killing ground. The iconic image of a castle gatehouse, with its portcullis, thick doors, and murder holes above, owes much to the defenders' desire to thwart battering rams and the troops that would follow behind them. Beyond architecture, the battering ram shaped the conduct of warfare itself. It turned sieges into complex operations requiring foresight and engineering skill. A besieging army with a good battering ram had a chance to take a fortress by storm, rather than waiting months for starvation to do the job. This put pressure on defenders to mount active counterattacks and to invest in stronger walls. In this way, the battering ram contributed to a medieval arms race. Stronger fortifications begat stronger siege engines, and vice versa. Each new improvement in ram technology or tactics was answered by innovations in defensive design. The end of the battering ram's era came about due to advancements in firepower. By the 15th century, gunpowder artillery had made its debut in Europe. Cannons could shatter castle walls from a safe distance, accomplishing in an hour what might take a battering ram days or weeks. As cannons grew more powerful and more common, traditional siege engines like trebuchets and battering rams rapidly fell out of use. Even so, a few vestiges of the old ways persisted. As late as 1429, during the Siege of Orleans, English forces built a covered battering ram siege shed, whimsically nicknamed the Sow, to attack the city walls, only to see French defenders sally out and burn it. The last great sieges of the Middle Ages saw iron cannonballs, not wooden rams, doing the decisive damage to fortress walls. Thus, the age of the battering ram, glorious and violent, gradually gave way to the age of gunpowder. Yet the legacy of the battering ram lives on. We see it in the language of warfare and even in modern breaching tactics. To ram something is to forcefully drive into it, a phrase born from this ancient weapon. Modern police and military units still use compact battering rams to break down doors in hostage rescues and raids, a direct descendant of the medieval siege ram, scaled down to a human level. More importantly, the battering ram endures as a symbol of relentless force. It represents the idea that with enough determination and strength, even the mightiest barrier can be broken. In the annals of military history, the battering ram stands as a testament to human ingenuity and the perpetual contest between offense and defense. Its story, from the mud brick walls of ancient Mesopotamia to the stone castles of medieval Europe, reminds us of an age when courage, muscle, and engineering combined to literally knock down the walls of the world. In siege warfare, battering rams could smash through gates and walls, but another engine promised to conquer fortifications from above: the siege tower. A siege tower was essentially a mobile, fortified ladder, a wooden tower on wheels, built tall enough to equal or exceed the height of a city wall. Inside, it could carry armed attackers safely to the wall's edge. When the tower was rolled up to the defences, a drawbridge or gangplank could be dropped onto the parapet, allowing soldiers to storm directly onto the enemy ramparts. This ingenious contraption would become one of the most imposing and complex siege weapons of the ancient and medieval worlds. Origins in the ancient world siege towers have their origins deep in antiquity. There is evidence that as early as the Bronze Age, over 4,000 years ago, armies were experimenting with wooden assault towers. An ancient Egyptian tomb painting from the First Intermediate Period depicts what may be a wheeled siege tower used in battle. In Anatolia, modern Turkey, archaeologists have even found a carved stone relief from around 2000 BC that shows a towering siege engine on wheels. These early hints suggest that the idea of a mobile tower for attacking fortifications was conceived long before it became commonplace. However, it was in the Iron Age, particularly under the Neo-Assyrian Empire of Mesopotamia, roughly 900 to 600 BC, that the siege tower truly entered warfare on a significant scale. The Assyrians were fearsome conquerors and pioneers of siegecraft. They fielded the first professional corps of military engineers and revolutionized how cities were taken. To smash through fortified walls, they combined multiple inventions: battering rams to break masonry, earthen ramps to reach wall height, and siege towers to deliver troops over the top. Assyrian siege towers were wooden structures often built several stories high, mounted on wheels or rollers. They were pushed up specially built ramps of earth and stone that led to the enemy walls. Inside the tower, Assyrian archers and spearmen sheltered behind wooden parapets. As the tower crept closer, these archers rained arrows on the defenders atop the walls, suppressing their fire. Meanwhile, some Assyrian towers also carried a battering ram in their lower level, a heavy log tipped with iron, which could be swung against the wall or gate once the tower was in range. In essence, the Assyrians created multi-purpose siege engines, part mobile fortress, part artillery platform, part gateway for infantry assault. One famous example comes from the siege of Lachish in 701 BC. The Assyrian king Sennacherib attacked this fortified city in Judah, and his artists later carved vivid reliefs of the battle on the walls of his palace. These carvings show massive wheeled siege engines approaching the city's walls on a built-up ramp. The machines appear to have a covered battering ram projecting out the front and several Assyrian bowmen shooting from within or atop the structure. Under this onslaught, arrows whizzing down at the ramparts and the ram hammering the stone wall, the defense of Lachish faltered. The city was taken, and the reliefs immortalized the siege tower as a key instrument of Assyrian victory. The Assyrians also understood the vulnerabilities of their wooden towers, particularly the danger of fire. A dry timber tower was an inviting target for flaming arrows or pots of oil hurled by defenders. To counter this, Assyrian engineers took precautions. Contemporary accounts and depictions suggest that towers were often clad in wet animal hides to make them fire-resistant. Assyrian soldiers also positioned water containers or hoses at the top of the tower, so that any fires that did catch could be doused immediately. These innovations, fireproof coverings and onboard firefighting, highlight the sophisticated engineering approach the Assyrians brought to siege warfare. As Assyrian conquests spread their military technology across the Near East, other cultures soon adopted the siege tower concept. The Babylonians and Persians, inheritors of Mesopotamian military knowledge, employed similar engines in their campaigns. By the 8th century BC, even armies far from Mesopotamia were building siege towers. For instance, in around 728 BC, the Kingdom of Kush, in Nubia, south of Egypt, laid siege to the Egyptian city of Memphis. The Kushite king Piye, determined to take the city, ordered a wooden siege tower constructed. From this tall tower, Kushite archers and slingers could fire down into the city, keeping the defenders pinned while attackers advanced. This is one of the earliest recorded uses of a siege tower outside Mesopotamia, demonstrating that the idea had spread throughout the Mediterranean and North African world. Classical advances: Greece and Alexander. In the classical Greek world, protracted sieges were less common during the early centuries. Many Greek city-states preferred open battle to settle disputes. Nonetheless, as warfare evolved, the Greeks began to incorporate advanced siege techniques, especially by the 5th century BC. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, between Athens and Sparta saw several sieges, and with them, the use of siege engines began to grow. Greek inventors tinkered with catapults, battering rams, and indeed siege towers. One early appearance of a Greek siege tower took place during the Athenian expedition to Sicily. In 415 to 413 BC, Athens tried to conquer Syracuse, a well-fortified city. The Athenians built large siege engines in an attempt to breach Syracuse's walls. According to historical accounts, they constructed at least one huge wooden tower on the Epipoli Plateau outside Syracuse. This tower was rolled up to the city's defensive walls as a platform for archers and stone throwers. At first, the presence of the towering engine allowed the Athenians to pressure the Syracusan defenders. However, the Syracuse garrison quickly devised a counterattack. In a night sortie, Syracusan troops sallied out and managed to set the Athenian siege tower on fire, possibly with torches or incendiary arrows. The great wooden machine went up in flames. With the tower destroyed, the Athenian assault stalled, and ultimately the siege failed disastrously for Athens. This episode underscored a key lesson that would echo through history. A siege tower, for all its imposing strength, could be undone by a simple flame if not properly protected. By the time of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC, Greek warfare had fully embraced large-scale siegecraft. Alexander inherited from his father, King Philip II of Macedon, a well-trained engineering corps and various siege machines. During Alexander's legendary campaigns, he faced fortified cities that would not submit willingly, and he brought formidable siege towers to those battles. The most famous example was the Siege of Tyre in 332 BC. Tyre was a heavily defended island city off the coast of Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. To capture it, Alexander undertook an engineering feat. He built a massive causeway, mole, across the sea to reach the island. On this narrow land bridge, his army advanced slowly toward Tyre's towering walls. The Tyrians were fierce defenders, and Alexander needed every siege engine at his disposal. He ordered the construction of enormous siege towers, reportedly around 7 stories tall, to roll up along the mole. These towers were essentially floating fortresses. Each was packed with Macedonian archers and artillery. Large catapults and ballistas inside the towers hurled stones and spears at the Tyrian ramparts, trying to suppress the defenders and create a safe zone for the final assault. These siege towers at Tyre were among the most impressive of the classical era. They were covered in rawhide leather to protect the wood from fire, and they bristled with weaponry. As they inched forward on the causeway, they allowed Alexander's forces to fight the defenders nearly eye to eye. But the Tyrians were resourceful. In a bold counter, they loaded an old horse transport ship with flammable materials, pitch, sulfur, and torches, turned it into a giant fire ship, and sent it crashing into Alexander's mole. The floating inferno set Alexander's siege towers ablaze and shattered sections of the causeway. For a moment, the conquest of Tyre seemed in jeopardy as the prized towers burned and collapsed into the sea. Alexander, however, was not easily deterred. He regrouped, ordered the construction of new towers, and pushed the mole forward again under heavy arrow fire. After months of grueling effort, the Macedonians reached the walls and brought their engines to bear. One of Alexander's siege towers finally allowed his men to lower a gangplank onto Tyre's wall, providing a bridge for assault troops. At the same time, a breach was made in the wall by other means. Macedonian soldiers swarmed into the city. Tyre fell after a siege of 7 months, a testament to Alexander's relentless use of engineering, and a vindication of the siege tower concept, despite the earlier setback. The siege of Tyre demonstrated how, with enough resources and ingenuity, even the strongest island fortress could be overcome by towers that brought attackers quite literally to the city walls. Siege towers were not limited to land warfare during this period. Naval warfare too sometimes featured siege towers in creative ways. The Greeks and later the Romans developed the tactic of mounting siege towers on ships to attack coastal fortifications or even enemy vessels. These were essentially early amphibious siege towers. For instance, during the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians at one point fixed towers onto ships to assault the seaward walls of enemy ports. Similarly, Alexander's engineers built siege towers on large ships during the sieges of coastal cities like Tyre and Gaza, allowing archers to fire down at defenders on otherwise inaccessible walls. By the time of Julius Caesar in the mid-1st century BC, shipborne towers had even been made with lighter, collapsible designs that could be transported on a ship's deck and then erected for an attack. This idea of mobile towers on water shows how versatile siege warfare had become by Alexander's time. Any place a fortress stood, whether on land or surrounded by water, attackers tried to bring a tower to it. Hellenistic giants, the Hellepolis and beyond. After Alexander's conquests, his generals and successors, the Diadochi, continued the tradition of grand sieges. The Hellenistic period, late 4th to 1st centuries BC, became an age of giant siege engines, as rival kingdoms vied to outdo each other in military engineering. Siege towers in this era reached a peak of size and complexity that the ancient world would never again surpass. The most legendary of these machines was the Hellepolis, which means taker of cities in Greek. It was constructed in 305 BC by Demetrius I of Macedon, known to history as Demetrius Poliorcetes, meaning the besieger, during his siege of the island city of Rhodes. Rhodes was wealthy and well defended, but Demetrius was determined to capture it. To that end, he commissioned the largest siege tower ever recorded. The Hellepolis was an astonishing contraption, roughly 40 meters tall, about 130 feet, and almost 20 meters wide. It rested on enormous wheels and featured 9 separate levels or stories within. Each level housed different kinds of artillery. Heavy catapults on the lower floors could smash stones into the city's walls at close range, while the higher floors held lighter catapults and ballistas that could sling bolts and arrows into the upper ramparts. Scores of sharpshooters were positioned in the tower as well, ready to pick off any defender who showed himself. By some accounts, around 200 soldiers were required to operate the Hellepolis, maneuver its machinery, push its wheels, and eventually rush out to attack once it reached the walls. Building and moving such a colossal engine was a Herculean task. Demetrius's engineers used strong timber beams and reinforced much of the tower's exterior with iron plates to shield it from fire and missiles. Its great size meant it could not simply be pushed by hand. Instead, a system of capstans, pulleys, and perhaps even a primitive rack and pinion mechanism was employed to inch it forward. On flat, open ground, this giant tower could roll forward like an armored siege castle. Indeed, it was more like a moving multi-story fortress than a mere tower. As the Helepolis lumbered toward Rhodes's walls, the city's inhabitants must have looked on in dread. Never before had such an edifice threatened their city. Yet even this Goliath had weaknesses. The Rhodians were familiar with siege warfare and realized that the huge tower needed solid, level ground to approach their walls. Acting quickly, they carried out a clever defensive measure. They flooded the ground in front of their fortifications, effectively turning the approach zone into a muddy quagmire. When Demetrius ordered the Helepolis forward, the giant wheels sank and the great tower bogged down in the mud before reaching the walls. Simultaneously, the defenders bombarded it with whatever artillery they had, attempting to damage or ignite it. Despite its iron cladding, the stuck tower became a liability. After intense fighting and frustration, Demetrius's assault failed. Eventually, he abandoned the siege of Rhodes altogether, sailing away in defeat. In a final twist of fate, the proud Helepolis was left behind. The Rhodians later dismantled the abandoned super tower and sold its materials for scrap. According to ancient historians, the profits from selling the bronze and iron fittings of the Helepolis helped fund the construction of a colossal statue in Rhodes, the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Thus, the greatest siege tower ever built indirectly gave birth to a famous monument celebrating the city's survival. Demetrius's Helepolis was the apex of ancient siege tower design, but it was not the only extraordinary engine of the Hellenistic age. Other successor kings also built formidable towers, if not quite as large. For example, many Hellenistic sieges featured multiple smaller siege towers used in tandem. Rather than relying on one single behemoth, besieging armies often rolled out several towers along a city's walls to spread out the defense. These towers provided covering fire for each other and allowed assaults on multiple points simultaneously. In some cases, towers were even mounted on barges or ships as part of coordinated land-sea attacks, a tactic similar to what Alexander and others had used. For instance, during Rome's war against King Mithridates VI in the 1st century BC, at the siege of the coastal city of Cyzicus, the attacking forces reportedly employed ship-borne towers alongside conventional siege works to assault the city's seaward walls. All these instances underscore that by the Hellenistic era, siege towers were a standard part of the besieger's arsenal, adapted to many environments and scales. It's worth noting that despite the remarkable ingenuity of ancient engineers, siege towers were not a universal solution. Many fortified cities remained practically immune to tower assaults simply due to their location. Hilltop fortresses or cities perched on cliffs could not be easily reached by a rolling tower. Attackers sometimes tried to construct earthen ramps up to such heights, but that could be an enormous effort, as the Romans would later demonstrate at Masada. Likewise, fortifications with broad moats or water barriers posed a serious challenge. Bridging a moat under fire to roll up a tower was extremely difficult. We saw how Rhodes used water to stop the Helepolis. Similarly, defenders could dig trenches or remove soil to create new ditches in a tower's path. In short, siege towers were a powerful tool on favorable terrain, but clever defenders and tricky landscapes could dramatically reduce their effectiveness. Roman siege warfare and towers. The torch of siegecraft passed next to the Romans. The Roman Republic and later the Empire became known for their formidable military engineering, learning much from the Greek and Hellenistic worlds they gradually conquered. Roman armies, characterized by discipline and organization, made heavy use of siege towers when attacking enemy cities. They inherited the ideas of towers from earlier times and refined them as part of a systematic approach to siege warfare. A hallmark of Roman sieges was thorough preparation. Roman legions would invest a city, build a circumvallation, a fortified line around it to prevent escape or reinforcement, and then methodically advance their siege works. Siege towers, or turris in Latin, were often constructed along with ramps, called an agger, to bring them within reach of the walls. One illustrative example of Roman techniques comes from Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, specifically the siege of Avaricum in 52 BC. Avaricum, in modern-day France, was a Gallic stronghold perched on a steep slope with a wooden palisade and earthen walls. Rather than starve it out, Caesar chose to storm it. Over 25 days, his soldiers built a massive earthen ramp up the slope, about 80 feet high and hundreds of feet long, an immense undertaking of manual labor. Upon this artificial hill, they rolled forward siege towers that Caesar had ordered to be constructed. These towers were topped with artillery and filled with legionaries. From their heights, Roman slingers and archers could target the Gallic warriors on the ramparts, while covered battering rams at the tower bases began to break down Avaricum's walls. The psychological impact of seeing the Romans literally raise the ground and approach with towering siege engines must have been immense. Ultimately, the Romans breached the defences, and Avaricum fell. Caesar's commentaries note how astonished the Gauls were by the speed and determination of the Roman siege works. Another famous Roman siege employing a tower was at Masada, decades later. Masada was a fortress built atop a rock plateau in the Judean desert. In 72 to 73 AD, during the Great Jewish Revolt, Roman governor Lucius Flavius Silva laid siege to Masada, where a group of Jewish rebels held out. The fortress sat upon a steep, sheer plateau, seemingly impregnable. But the Romans resolved to bring a siege tower to its walls. They marshaled thousands of soldiers and Jewish prisoners to build a giant ramp out of earth and wooden supports, sloping up the mountainside. Over weeks, this ramp grew until it reached nearly the height of Masada's walls. Then the Romans constructed a tall siege tower, outfitted with a battering ram and siege weapons, and laboriously pushed it up the ramp. In the final assault, the tower stood on the crest of the ramp, looming over the defenders. The ram pounded a breach in the fortress wall, and Roman troops poured through. Masada fell, facilitated by the combination of ramp and tower that allowed the attackers to surmount what nature had made almost unassailable. This siege demonstrated that even the most daunting natural fortifications could be overcome with enough engineering effort and the effective use of a siege tower. The Romans had many such examples across their vast empire. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, part of the First Jewish-Roman War, Roman legions led by Titus besieged the heavily fortified city of Jerusalem. The city's defences were formidable, multiple concentric walls with dozens of towers, including 3 massive towers guarding the main citadel. Titus's forces built large siege towers and, after intense fighting, brought them up against the outer walls. According to the historian Flavius Josephus, an eyewitness to the siege, the Romans managed at one point to position towers so that they overlooked the city's battlements, allowing Roman archers and slingers on the tower platforms to rain down missiles on the defenders. Jewish rebels, however, responded with creative countermeasures. They tunneled out beneath the ground, approaching the Roman ramps and set fires, causing the earthworks to collapse. In one night, an entire section of Roman siege rampart gave way, and the great siege towers on it crashed into pits of fire. This setback shocked the Romans, a vivid demonstration that defenders who were skilled engineers could turn the tables and destroy even the mightiest siege works. Nevertheless, the Romans did not relent. Titus regrouped, built new ramps, and brought up more towers. Eventually, relentless battering and multiple assaults broke Jerusalem's defences. The second wall was breached, then the Antonia fortress, and finally, the Romans overwhelmed the last defenders in the temple precinct. Siege towers had helped the Roman army get close enough to make these decisive breaches, though not without cost. Roman siege towers were generally somewhat smaller and more standardized than the singular behemoths of the Hellenistic age, but the Romans often used them in greater numbers simultaneously. They also integrated towers with other tactics: constant artillery bombardment from catapults, sappers digging tunnels to undermine walls, and coordinated assaults by infantry once a breach or scaling opportunity appeared. Often, multiple towers would be rolled out at different points along a wall to stretch the defense thin. Each tower carried a contingent of legionaries ready to storm the battlements once the wall was reached. The combination of all these methods made the Roman military a master of sieges by the height of the empire. Additionally, the Romans continued the practice of mounting siege towers on ships for certain operations. During the Roman siege of Syracuse in 214 to 212 BC, in the Second Punic War, the general Marcus Claudius Marcellus attacked the city both by land and sea. He equipped some of his larger ships with siege towers to assault Syracuse's seaward walls, attempting to replicate the successes of earlier naval towers. However, Syracuse's defender, the brilliant Archimedes, devised powerful defensive engines that sank or incapacitated many of these ships. Marcellus's floating towers met limited success against Archimedes' war machines, illustrating that siege towers were no panacea, especially when confronted by exceptional defensive ingenuity. Still, the Romans' willingness to employ such tactics shows their commitment to using siege towers whenever they might confer an advantage. By the late Republic and early Empire, Roman military engineers had even developed portable or collapsible siege towers that could be prefabricated and transported with the army. This meant a campaign force could carry sections of a wooden tower, then quickly assemble it on site during a siege, saving time compared to building from scratch under enemy fire. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, the sophisticated siege techniques of antiquity saw a period of decline in Western Europe. The early Middle Ages were marked by smaller-scale warfare and fewer protracted sieges. Many warlords lacked the resources or know-how to construct massive siege towers of the old style. However, the knowledge was never entirely lost. The Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire continued to preserve and refine classical military engineering. Manuscripts like the military treatise of Vegetius and others kept descriptions of siegecraft alive. Thus, when larger, fortified cities and castles re-emerged as prime military targets in Europe by the 10th and 11th centuries, the stage was set for siege towers to rise again. Medieval rebirth and zenith. As the medieval period progressed, especially by the 11th century, sieges once again became crucial in warfare. The rise of feudal castles and fortified towns across Europe and the Middle East meant attackers had to crack some very tough strongholds. With this need, many siege techniques from antiquity were revived, including the construction of siege towers. The builders of these medieval towers often drew on classical texts or on local traditions of siegecraft preserved since Roman times. In some cases, they simply reinvented solutions out of necessity. By the High Middle Ages, siege towers were back on the battlefield in a big way. Interestingly, one of the early instances of a medieval siege tower comes from a people outside the traditional European feudal sphere, the Avars. The Avars were a nomadic confederation from the Eurasian steppes who, in alliance with the Persians, besieged Constantinople in the year 626 AD. Constantinople's mighty double walls were the pinnacle of defensive architecture at the time. Yet the Avars, normally known as cavalry warriors, attempted to use advanced siege methods drawn from their contact with the Persians, and perhaps captured Byzantine engineers. According to Byzantine chronicles, the Avars constructed no fewer than 12 lofty siege towers and rolled them up to the land walls of Constantinople. These towers were covered in hides to protect them from Greek fire and other incendiaries. It must have been an awe-inspiring, if desperate, sight. A dozen towering structures laden with warriors pressing against the most famous city walls in the world. Despite their efforts, the siege failed. The towers could not overcome Constantinople's formidable defenses, and the Avars were ultimately forced to withdraw. Nevertheless, this event shows that the concept of siege towers had survived into the early medieval era, even if such engines were not commonly seen in the West for a few more centuries. By the time of the Crusades, late 11th through 13th centuries, large armies in Europe and the Middle East were once again routinely building siege towers. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, provides a dramatic example. The Crusaders, a mix of Frankish, Norman, and other European knights and foot soldiers, found themselves facing the imposing walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. The Holy City's defenses were strong, and the Crusaders had very limited supplies after a long campaign. There were few trees in the surrounding region. Many had been cut down or burned, and wood was scarce. Yet, determined to take the city, the Crusaders scrounged materials wherever they could. They dismantled wooden huts and even took apart ships that had been laboriously transported overland from the port of Jaffa in order to gather enough timber. Under the direction of skilled leaders and carpenters, the Crusaders constructed several siege towers from this patchwork of wood. One of these towers was commanded by Duke Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the Crusades' principal commanders. The tower was constructed behind cover so as not to be destroyed before it was ready. The Fatimid Egyptian garrison inside Jerusalem, well aware of what the Crusaders were doing, prepared countermeasures. Notably, they readied fire arrows and Greek fire, an incendiary liquid, to use against the towers. When the assault began in July 1099, the Crusader siege towers lumbered toward Jerusalem's walls. Initially, Godfrey's tower was targeted by the defenders who attempted to set it alight. But the Crusaders had anticipated this. They had shielded their towers with rawhide and soaked parts of the wood in vinegar, a tactic learned perhaps from older military knowledge or earlier in the campaign. Greek fire was a terrifying weapon that could stick to surfaces and burn even on water, and water alone did little to quench it. Vinegar, however, was believed to help neutralize Greek fire's chemical composition. Thus, when flaming oil and tar pots were hurled at Godfrey's siege tower, the coverings sizzled but did not ignite into a full blaze. Crusaders inside the tower furiously doused any sparks with water and vinegar-soaked cloths. As the fighting raged, Godfrey made a tactical decision. He had his men secretly adjust the tower's position. In the middle of the night, the Crusaders moved the massive tower along the wall to a slightly weaker section, perhaps a spot less ably defended or where the ditch was narrower, all under the cover of darkness. The next morning, to the defenders' surprise, the great tower was not where they expected, but was approaching a different part of the wall near the northeast corner of the city. Under intense fighting, the tower reached the walls. At the top level of the structure was a drawbridge mechanism. Godfrey and his knights, armored and ready, waited until the tower was pressed right up to the parapet. Then the drawbridge was dropped. With a heavy thud, it slammed onto the wall top, forming a sudden bridge between the tower and Jerusalem's battlements. Godfrey of Bouillon was among the first to dash across, followed by his knights and footmen. A fierce melee on the walls ensued. The Fatimid defenders, who had fought bravely for weeks, were overwhelmed at this breach. Soon, Crusader flags waved from the ramparts. By the evening of July 15, 1099, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, in large part due to that siege tower delivering attackers straight onto its walls. The victory at Jerusalem was a defining moment of the First Crusade, and the siege tower went down in the chronicles as the crucial instrument of that conquest. The Crusaders did not forget this lesson. In subsequent campaigns and crusades, they repeatedly employed siege towers. During the siege of Tyre in 1124, for example, not to be confused with Alexander's siege centuries earlier at the same city, the Crusaders and their Venetian allies used both land-based towers and a novel floating siege tower. Tyre, now controlled by Muslim forces, was besieged from land by the Crusader army, but it also had a seaward defence anchored by a chain stretching across the harbour entrance, attached to a stout tower in the harbour. The Venetian navy came up with a solution. They lashed ships together to form a stable platform and constructed a tall wooden siege tower on this makeshift raft. Covered with protective skins, this floating tower was manoeuvred close to the harbour tower that held the chain. After heavy fighting, stones and fire hurled back and forth. The Venetian tower gave the attackers the advantage. The Venetian and Crusader troops stormed across from their ship-borne tower onto Tyre's chain tower, capturing it and breaking the defensive chain. With the harbour breached and multiple land towers also pressing in, Tyre's garrison eventually surrendered. This episode highlights medieval ingenuity. Even at sea, the basic concept of the siege tower, raising troops up to the enemy's level, proved its worth when adapted cleverly. Another instance of siege tower innovation came during the Fifth Crusade's attack on Damietta in Egypt in 1218. Damietta's defences included a massive tower in the Nile River, anchoring one end of a chain that blocked the harbour. The Crusaders' initial assaults on this river tower, by boat and ladder, failed miserably as the strong currents and the defenders' missiles drove them back. Realizing that conventional attacks would not work, the Crusaders, under a leader named Oliver of Paderborn, built an extraordinary contraption. They bound two large ships together to serve as a stable base, and on top of this double hull, they erected a multi-story siege tower. This naval siege tower was outfitted with a long assault ladder and covered in protective cowhide, just like a land tower. By August 24, 1218, the floating tower was ready. Under covering fire from Crusader catapults, the contraption was rowed and poled toward the huge river tower. Once close enough, the Crusaders dropped the assault bridge from their ship tower onto the summit of the Damietta Tower. Knights and soldiers rushed across amid a storm of arrows. In vicious close-quarters combat high above the water, they managed to overpower the tower's garrison by the next day. The banner of the crusade was raised atop the captured river tower. With the chain barrier removed, the Crusader fleet could sail into the harbour and support the land attack. Eventually, after prolonged fighting, Damietta fell. This daring capture of the Nile Tower, essentially using a custom-built floating siege tower, was celebrated by chroniclers of the time as proof of divine favour and human ingenuity. Back in Europe, siege towers were employed in many medieval conflicts as well, wherever castles or walled cities had to be taken by force. One notable example in England was the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 during the Second Barons' War. Kenilworth was a powerful fortress, surrounded by a large lake, a flooded marsh, which made traditional approaches difficult. Royal forces besieging the rebel barons holed up in the castle resorted to building an enormous siege tower to try to end the stalemate. Chroniclers say this wooden tower was so large that it contained multiple trebuchets, stone-throwing catapults, on its platforms and housed 200 archers who could shoot from its various levels. It was essentially a moving artillery platform and assault tower combined. The attackers laboriously dragged this giant tower towards the castle across causeways they built over the marsh. Despite these efforts, Kenilworth's defence was so tenacious and its water defences so effective that the siege dragged on for almost a year, the longest in English history. In the end, disease and starvation forced the garrison to negotiate a surrender, more than any direct assault by the siege tower itself. Nonetheless, the use of such a mega-tower at Kenilworth shows how, in the high medieval period, armies were willing to invest enormous effort into these machines, hoping to break a castle's defences through sheer force and height. Defenders did not sit idly by while siege towers approached. Throughout the Middle Ages, those under siege evolved their tactics to counter towers, just as their ancient predecessors had. Castles built in the later medieval period often featured design elements meant to thwart siege towers. A common feature was a deep, water-filled moat around the walls. The moat served to keep towers at a distance. If attackers tried to fill the moat with rubble or bundles of sticks to roll a tower over, they would have to work under fire from the castle. Some castles also had outer earthen embankments and ditches that made the ground uneven and treacherous for heavy engines. Another architectural development was the talus, an angled slope at the base of a castle wall, usually built of stone or packed earth. The talus inclined outward from the wall's base, meaning a siege tower could not get flush against the vertical section of the wall. It would be forced to rest on the sloping surface at an awkward angle, or its bridge would gap away from the wall's top. The sloping talus also helped deflect missiles and made attempts to mine the wall more difficult. These passive defenses made it far more challenging to deploy a siege tower effectively. Active defenses against towers continued to rely on fire and bombardment. Medieval defenders, like those of earlier eras, used firepots, tar and flaming arrows liberally against wooden engines. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the use of Greek fire, or similar incendiaries, had spread beyond the Byzantines. In the Crusades, both Muslim and Christian forces at times used fire-based weapons to destroy siege equipment. The chronicles of various sieges describe towers being burned. For instance, during the First Crusade siege of Jerusalem in 1099, one of the Crusaders' other towers, not Godfrey's, was successfully set ablaze by the defenders before it could reach the wall. At the Third Crusade's siege of Acre in 1191, the Muslim garrison repeatedly managed to destroy or damage the Crusaders' siege towers with catapult fire and incendiary arrows, prolonging the siege until the attackers redoubled their efforts. In response to these threats, attackers learned to cover their towers with flame-resistant materials, not only soaked hides, but sometimes thin iron sheets or chains draped over the wood to absorb the impact of heavy projectiles. Some accounts suggest that metal plates or shields were affixed to parts of siege towers for added protection, though covering an entire tower in iron was generally impractical due to the weight. Instead, layers of wet animal hide remained the most common defensive covering on medieval towers. Another tactic for defenders was to target the base or support of the tower. A well-aimed shot from a trebuchet could smash a wheel or corner of a tower, potentially causing it to collapse or at least halt its advance. Defenders also tried digging pits or collapsing tunnels in the path of an approaching tower, as seen in the Jerusalem siege, to literally undermine the enemy's engines. Any means to prevent the tower from reaching the wall was worth attempting, because once an assault tower successfully bridged onto the battlements, the fight often swung in favor of the attackers, who then had a protected route right into the heart of the fortification. For the attackers, constructing a siege tower was a race against time and a test of logistics as much as engineering skill. Wood had to be gathered, often a serious challenge if the siege took place in a barren region, or if the defenders had preemptively cleared the surroundings of trees. The tower's dimensions had to be tailored to the target. Building a tower taller than the enemy walls was necessary to give attackers a firing advantage, but any excess height wasted precious materials. Conversely, a tower too short would be useless. Typically, medieval siege towers were built to just over the height of the walls they faced. Construction usually took place behind screens or in dips in the terrain to hide the work from the defenders as long as possible. Attackers might erect large wooden shields, mantlets, or use natural hills to conceal the rising frame of a tower. Once completed and on the move, the tower advanced slowly, usually timed with a general assault. Teams of soldiers or draft animals, oxen or horses, hauled it forward, though in the final stretch, animals were often taken off to avoid being killed, and men inside or behind the tower pushed it into position. Every yard closer brought an increase in arrows and stones raining down. It was a tense contest. Could the attackers roll their tower to the wall intact, or would the defenders cripple it in time? By the 13th century, the sight of a siege tower on the battlefield had become almost routine in large-scale sieges. These towering wooden behemoths had re-established themselves as a cornerstone of siege warfare, just as critical in a medieval commander's plans as they had been to kings in antiquity. The medieval period, in effect, saw the last great flourishing of the siege tower as an engine of war. As the 14th century dawned, however, this long era was drawing to a close, due to a revolutionary change in military technology. In summary, the siege tower was a product of necessity. As soon as humans built walls, others sought ways to go over those walls. From the Bronze Age to the late Middle Ages, siege towers evolved in design and grew in size, but they always served the same fundamental purpose: to elevate attackers to the level of the defenders. They were testaments to human innovation in warfare, requiring enormous labor to build and courage to operate. Whether in the hands of Assyrian kings, Greek generals, Roman emperors, or Crusader lords, these mobile towers proved their worth time and again until changes in warfare rendered them antiquated. Standing tall and moving slowly, siege towers ultimately yielded to the roar of cannon fire and the new sciences of fortification.